Hi, welcome everyone. I'm Michaela Schmidt, a program coordinator here at the Pulitzer Center. As everyone's joining in, please feel free to let us know in the chat where you're listening in from. If you haven't joined us before, the Pulitzer Center is a nonprofit journalism and education organization dedicated to raising awareness of underreported global issues. Last year, we supported 275 reporting projects in collaboration with journalists and filmmakers in news outlets around the world. We work with classrooms and communities to extend the impact of journalism and cultivate public engagement with these issues globally. You can learn more about our work in our 2022 annual report, which I'm going to share a link to in the chat. Just a few logistics before we begin our conversation. You'll see a Q&A icon on your screen. You can begin adding your questions for our panelists at any time throughout our discussion. There's also a chat icon on your screen. We'd appreciate if you use that for specific tech issues. We want to let you know that we are recording this session and we will post it online following the webinar. One other note, we'd really appreciate if you stay once the panel ends for just a brief survey so we can improve our events. Today, I'm really excited to introduce this wonderful panel that we have, starting with Don Kevin Hapal. He is a journalist specializing in propaganda and disinformation research. He started his career in the media as a digital communications specialist at the Philippines-based news site Rappler, and then went on to lead their section for overseas Filipinos and migrant workers, Balikbayans. He then transitioned to data journalism, being a part of the team that pioneered disinformation research at Rappler. He helped craft Rappler's digital forensics methodologies, and he's written extensively about state-sponsored propaganda and disinformation, online harassment of journalists and red tagging, and the malicious blacklisting of individuals or organizations as communities or terrorists. His Pulitzer-supported project, Pride and Prejudice, applied data forensics to investigate disinformation around legal protection and discrimination towards the Filipino queer community. Mahmoud Hassino is a journalist and advocate for LGBTQ and refugee rights and has been committed to the cause of equality since 2005. He started his career in print and radio journalism. In 2012, in his native country, Syria, he founded Mawale, Syria's first LGBTQ+ online magazine, serving as a crucial beacon for the Syrian queer community. He continued his journalism work during the Syrian civil war and later created Mr. Gay Syria, a contest to promote LGBT rights during the European refugee crisis. After arriving in Germany in 2014, he transitioned into a role as a counselor working with LGBTQ+ asylum seekers, refugees, and migrants in Berlin, and became a vocal advocate for queer refugee rights in Europe. He holds an MSc in cyber psychology of online communication, which gives him insights into the dynamics of online hate speech and the impacts of digital spaces and social movements. In collaboration with Barbara Flood and with the support of the Pulitzer Center, he produced a podcast called I Am Not Your Refugee, which reframes refugee narratives. Ankur Paliwal is an independent queer journalist and founder of Queerbeat, which is a collaborative journalism venture focused on accurately covering LGBTQIA+ people. He has reported about science, inequality, and queer people from South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa for many international outlets such as The Guardian, Scientific America, and Nature. He lives in New Delhi. Queerbeat partnered with the Pulitzer Center to support Queer Lives in India, which tells the story of LGBTQ+ communities living in a deeply homophobic and transphobic culture. Apologies, I realized I missed part of that link there. Let me send a more accurate one. And finally, we have Ester Pinheiro. She is a Brazilian independent journalist with an MA in Gender Studies from the Complutense University of Madrid. She is the founder of Feminismos del Sur podcast, a multilingual podcast that deepens and echoes decolonial voices in the global South. Ester has worked for media outlets, the UN, and NGOs covering primarily gender and how it relates to climate change, social justice, health, and migration. She has been acknowledged for her work as a young peace builder from UNAOC, Google News Initiative Fellow, and others. Her Pulitzer-supported project, Beyond the Land of Cordality, highlights transgender and queer people living in Brazil, which has been ranked as the country with the largest number of trans people murdered. Thank you all so much for joining us today. We are really excited about this panel. So first off, I just want to start by having each of our panelists give a little bit of an overview of their projects that I mentioned and tell us a bit about the queer community in the countries that they've reported from. So Don, why don't we start off with you?
Hi, can you hear me? Hi, Michaela. Thank you. Thank you again to everyone for coming, and thank you for Pulitzer for this opportunity to talk here. So the story I wrote for the Pulitzer, it's a two-part series published on Rappler. It's a new site here in the Philippines. It's basically an analysis of the disinformation around a specific bill here. It's called the SOGI Anti-Discrimination Bill. And as the name suggests, it's basically just a bill that seeks legal protection for people against SOGI-based discrimination. So discrimination based on sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression. And it's very important for the community here because it's trying to address a very real and widely documented forms of discrimination here that the community is facing on the ground in schools, in the workplace, or even within their households. For example, it wants to prohibit non-admission of queers into school or employers discriminating against queer applicants. So these are very basic but important protections for the community. And the problem is it's been sitting in our Congress, our legislative body here, for 23 years now. It was first filed in the year 2000, and up to now, it's still not a law. So the pushback against it, that's a context, it's very expected, obviously, because we're 80% Catholic here in the Philippines, or our politicians here also have to appeal to a vastly conservative voter population if they want to be elected. Um, and in my story, I've detailed how advocates have used what channels are available to them to push for the bill, but they're also up against massive disinformation about the bill online. And if you're familiar with the digital landscape here in the Philippines, it's really plagued with disinformation. The networks that we saw were a mix of both religious and political entities. And they were working, they were coordinated, organized, and we found them to be effectively corrupting the discourse about the bill, because they were not only pushing a lot of false claims about what the bill does and what the bill will do and about the community, but they're also rallying people to speak up against it by co-opting the language of human rights advocates. I'm not sure if it's the same for other countries, but for example, here the networks would try to say that the bill is seeking special rights for the LGBT community, ergo it's discriminating against the majority. That didn't come from it, that actually came from the machinery, saying that it's discriminatory against Catholics. So they're flipping the narrative to say that they are the victims of disinformation, that the community is bullying the 80%. So that was my story. As for some context on cultural perceptions here about the LGBT, as I said earlier, the Philippines is, a majority of Filipinos are Catholic, so that should give you some idea of how we're perceived here. The human rights situation here in the Philippines isn't exactly the best in the region, as some of you might have already heard. But in my story, I did say that our country has a very complicated and somewhat ironic relationship with the community, because right now, if you Google LGBT acceptance in the Philippines, you'd see global surveys claiming we're among the most LGBT friendly countries in Asia, right? But if you look at like local studies, survey, or even just talk to LGBT people on the ground, you'd hear that the community is still largely disadvantaged and discriminated against on a systemic level. And I think it's because people here find it in general hard to differentiate between being truly accepting and being tolerating. So for a lot of people here, as long as you're not outright being aggressive, or we're not outlawing being queer like in other countries, you'll find then it's okay, right? there's this refusal to acknowledge that we have a problem, that we're not being treated as equal in the status quo. And a big part of that is also because there's a lot of disinformation that tries to deny the LGBT struggle, like that the CHR, the Rights Commission here would, detail how LGBT children are being subjected to physical violence at home, being bullied in schools, even abused by law enforcers. I could go and on and on. But in general, if you ask people here about how they feel about the community, they will tell you, we don't have problems with them, we love them. But if I ask them, will you support Sogi Bill? No, because they've been made to believe it's discriminatory towards them and that their struggles aren't real. So yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much. We'll dive into a lot of the things you mentioned, but let's move on to Mahmoud. Looks like you're still muted. There we go, I think.
Yeah, so our project with the Pulitzer Center was called I'm Not Your Refugee. It was a podcast series about refugee-led projects in Europe. And basically, there was an episode about refugees in Turkey, which is like really relevant to the topic of LGBT movement and queer movement. Because basically I come from Syria, and in Syria, homosexuality is criminalized by law. And the same situation applies in Lebanon, but of course in Iran, and like most of the regions. So our region is a little bit like, in a similar situation. And basically, for me, like, for a couple of years, I have been doing this LGBT refugee advocacy, especially with the EU Turkey deal that prevents refugees from coming from and forces them to be like, handed back to Turkey. And what we needed was something to highlight about the situation of LGBT asylum seekers and refugees in outside of the EU, and why it was relevant to have people resettled to Europe in a faster way. Unfortunately, the European Union doesn't really look at the situation of LGBT refugees or asylum seekers as an urgent thing, especially if they are in Turkey. Although the situation in the country has been deteriorating for locals even, right? So I mean, I think now it's the 6th year now the Pride is banned this year in Istanbul, and there is a lot of there is this assigning refugees, especially trans women, to smaller towns and satellite cities around Turkey, not allowing them to come to bigger cities where actually they might have better emotional support and plus medical support as well. So the situation in the episode, we interviewed some of those activists in Turkey who are trying to discuss the situation. There is unfortunately the discussion about refugees and worldwide is it's the refugees are being stigmatized, and in the process LGBT refugees who are running away from maybe death sentences in some countries cannot have access to needed mental and healthcare services, as well as access to actually safety, and they are prevented from coming to Europe by this European Turkey deal that was signed in 2016. And unfortunately, like I said, most people in Turkey, and when we discussed those also, most people in Greece as well, LGBT asylum seekers or refugees or migrants, they come from like mainly this region where there is either a death penalty or a prison penalty for imprisonment for being an LGBT person. Yeah, it's this whole situation was like about like the refugee, this refugee situation in Europe, how to change the discourse a little bit around refugee topics, how to put, but there's also just moving the discussion from this victimhood to active participation by refugees. And yeah, Barbara Flood, my co-producer of the podcast, she traveled around and interviewed people in person mostly, and yes, unfortunately it is still like, I mean, we are still having more and more strict asylum procedures, so there is still more. There is need for more and more about refugee situation in Europe in general.
Yeah, thank you so much. Ankur, will you share next?
Yeah, sure. And thanks for the opportunity. It's a really great webinar and I'm happy to be a part of it. So my project with the Pulitzer Center really looks at the underreported stories of LGBTQIA+ people in India. It's not that there is no coverage of our issues, but the coverage tends to be very repetitive. So what we wanted to highlight is that what are the stories about queer lives in India that are not getting heard or getting the attention. So it's a 4-part series. 3 are already out. One story looks at the systematic discrimination that trans people face in India. A lot of them have to leave home or are forced out of their home. So what happens after that? Another story looked at the issues and concerns of older queer people, which remain invisible in most countries. So what's happening with them? What do they want? What kind of support systems exist for them? And the third story looked at the barriers that queer women specifically face when they try to access mental health care in small town India. And so all these stories really highlight underreported conversations about queer community in India. And just to give a bit more perspective on the community in India, same-sex sexual activity was decriminalized in 2018. And right now, the Supreme Court of India is hearing petitions on marriage equality. So it might seem that everything is okay and the queer community is protected and happy and things are moving forward, but actually no. We know that court judgments don't change cultures and they don't reach a lot of people and they don't change mindsets, which is why stories like these are needed, and they are needed in different languages. They need to be accessible. And that is not happening in India, which is why I'm doing this project and doing Queerbeat. For a bit more context, we don't have data on the percentage of population of queer people in India, but surveys have estimated 17% of India's population. And India is the most populous country in the world, and 17% means a lot. And this is the community that has historically been disserved by the media and by most service providers. That's all from me.
Yeah, thank you. And finally, Esther.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mike, for this opportunity. So my reporting project is called Beyond the Lens of Cordiality, which is the most trans people in the world. And by the way, I'm sorry if this content might trigger you, but I'll be talking about suicide and some violence data. So the project was published strategically last year in January 29th, because it's the Day of Trans Visibility in Brazil. So I had this idea to work on a multimedia project in a long-form article, but also with graphics, illustrations, and comics. And the idea was to recognize trans people as legitimate citizens who are part of Brazilian society, So the questions that drove me to this report were actually the lack of data. There is no national census about trans people. So are they included in the labor market? What sort of social policies can be taken to improve their quality of life? Not even the violence is counted. So usually we have to use international data or some NGOs that are doing this data work. So how can we build policies that represent this group if their needs, and in their needs, if they don't have data that reflects what the needs are? So we can't. So the question was, what is to be a transgender person in Brazil? And it was a very bold attempt because I was trying to report this full overview, what it was to be a trans person in many social spheres, business, politics, health, work. There were many questions to be answered, but this report was part just to start the conversation about trans people in the sense of their human rights, in a country that hides this trans feminicide and queerphobia with this cordiality and open future kind of national identity. So I believe it's important to just mention this concrete context. Brazil is, like Michaela said, one of the countries with the biggest trans population in the world. And because of this trans population, there is this belief that we are all happily living together with our gender diversity. But unfortunately, Brazil is the country which kills the most trans people in the world in a row. It's been 14 years now, so this gives a portrait of the context I was writing about. And I wanted to do a contrast on this national identity that is perceived abroad to bring attention to the reality of trans people in the country, particularly women who suffer the most. Just to give a more perspective, last year, at least 130 trans women were murdered, according to NGOs, like I mentioned before, the most important one called UNICEF. And still, their data is, well, we all know there are potential unreported and unmeasured cases as well. So the question you might be thinking is, what ideas are behind those feelings and what are the cultural perceptions of the queer community in Brazil? Actually, the queer community in general also suffers from murder. Last year, 140 lesbians and gays were killed. For you to have an idea. And what is behind this is Christian conservatism and fundamentalism, as some other peers have mentioned. They are very strong forces in the future. And although half of the population in Brazil don't consider themselves like religious, the future is kind of embedded in this hate landscape and lack of queer acceptation. It's a very patriarchal, heterosexual society that works on educate in this binary system. So everyone that goes beyond this hetero line, let's say like this, it is excluded. Their lives are not considered worth it, so they can be mother, they have to convert themselves, they have to cure all these stigmas and myths that we probably already heard about that can lead to crimes, can lead to murdering as it is written. So currently in Brazil, xenophobia is getting worse. There are a lot of disinformation campaigns about trans kids, particularly, and trans women on social media by politicians, by scammers and influential people in the country who are trying to cut back trans and queer rights and their achievements as well. Because now they have some political, for example, power. There are some representatives, and they are trying to cut this back. So this online hate as well that they suffer is the online and offline hate is real, and it impacts everyone, and not just the queer community. Right? Girls in Brazil who aren't as feminine as this patriarchal society expects, they have been chased as well when you go to the toilet, when you go to play sports, they have to prove their gender. Recently, a Brazilian journalist, very famous, she's called Sandra Berg, she was hugely condemned for using inclusive pronouns, for example. She referred to the queer community on Pride. So that's the Brazilian cultural aspect, which is important to know here.
Thank you, everyone, so much. That's helpful context as we get into our conversation here. So as you all described, queer communities in all of these countries are an especially vulnerable population experiencing discrimination and at times violence. So how did this influence your reporting process? And how did you build trust with the queer communities and prioritize their safety throughout their reporting? and anyone is welcome to hop in here.
I can
May I?
take this. Go ahead, Mahmoud. You first.
Yeah. Yeah. I would say, I mean, I did Mawala when this online magazine when and we had people coming to us through Facebook page and like emails and sometimes Twitter to share their stories. For us, it was always we had a person who is like one of our contributors and people who worked with us was like a very good in online security, especially with the situation in Syria at the time. So he always told people about like the best way to communicate with us before even starting, like asking them questions and stuff. And we thought it was good because like I mean basically throughout our work, we decided to have this strategy also with the contributors, with the people who wanted to send us something, because it was in a situation like Ankur said before, even forgetting about the laws, there is a culture of homophobia in the region. So it might be like people might be subject to hate crime or the so-called honor crime that used to happen also a lot in Syria and South Turkey. So for us, it was like this thing of like having the first responding person to the messages, the person who really knows their way around online security and how to protect yourself. And if you want to send us something, you need to send it this way and this way. So at least like nobody could see the communication, and just in case. And I think this was something that, of course, we wanted to publish stories, but we wanted to prioritize the safety of the people because we cannot publish a story and then endanger a person's life. I mean, this was the thing that we did at the time.
Right. I just very quickly add is that one thing that we try to do at Queerbeat and we did with this project with Pulitzer Center is from the very beginning, start explaining consequences to the communities. A lot of times, because these stories are from rural India, small towns, and the queer community is so vulnerable, and they're not media savvy. They don't know what does it really mean to have their stories out. What does anonymity mean? What could happen even if the story is published in English, it could be translated in a local language. What would it mean for you? So constantly trying to talk to them to explain harm, what could happen to you, and that you have a right to refuse to talk to me. You have the right to take back your code. So really giving them the power over their own narrative, what they want to reveal, what they want to hold back, constantly negotiating, talking to them, explaining things to them, so that we are telling the stories that represent really their world. And we are not imposing any narratives on them, which generally happens in the media. So I think this point of constantly telling them what harm could mean or could look like for you is really important.
I agree with Ankur. I think it helps that I'm queer myself, so I'm very much aware of how consequential it can be, or sometimes dangerous, to come out as queer, especially here in the global South, where online violence can quickly, cross into the real world. So we're very conscious about the environment we live in. So we have to be extra considerate of how different circumstances can be also between different people, even though we live in the same community. With anonymize when necessary. So you have to look at the impact of your story from the point of view of the subject, because you wouldn't want to, and you wouldn't want to compromise their safety for any story, not even for a great cause. And it's very important to highlight that, like Ankur said, sometimes the subject themselves aren't able to fully realize just how much impact a story will have on their lives. So we always make sure that before we quote anyone, before we publish, there's like informed consent of the subjects. By informed consent, I mean they need to understand the potential consequences of the stories, what kind of harm will they be exposed to, and if ever they do get exposed to those harms, what are, what can they do? Who can help them? How can we help them? So those are the things that we have to consider.
So I relate with what Don and also Ankur were sharing about communicating. So I build trust with my sources by talking to them before interviewing them through the phone, because also we were doing this during those difficult COVID-19 times. So it was almost impossible to meet them in person, but just to showing them the importance of this project, but also the risks, right, of talking, especially because I was covering transfeminicide and, well, all this violence that was happening in Brazil, that it's actually covered and supported for some politicians. So it was really like there was a risk for their lives, for their work, because some of them, they were working on public policies, they were working at CEOs for important trans organizations. So I was just making sure that they could have this reliability with us. And also one thing that I think supported them, it was the fact that it was very clear from the beginning what the aim of this project was, just being very transparent to them on how the questions would be going, or what kind of level of narratives that we are going to share, and just making sure that they were comfortable about talking about their experiences. And one thing that I think it's really important to mention here as well, since I was covering this context of transfeminicide, is that I decided to go for a more data-driven report than going to get their sources, stories, particularly who were, for example, families of trans people murdered. So this is one editorial choice of mine that it's not better than any others. It's just that for me, I had this feeling that I didn't want to re-victimize them or make them suffer again to tell those stories, make their families go through this painful moment. So I thought it could be better to do a data-driven report, just listening to trans people in all these social spheres, political, labor, health, the favela communities, and how they perceive to be a trans person into this context of violence that I'm talking about. So I thought on this way, it also, in a way, was more kind of safer to them, because they were not directly impacted by transfeminicide in their families, and there was no investigation ongoing, for example. So I just made sure that communication was part of the process, and also they were comfortable about sharing their experiences.
Yeah, and Esther, I want to dive into that just a little bit more, because I know you've mentioned that in addition to the mainly data-driven piece, you also developed a series of comics. So can you tell us a bit more about that and how that threat of violence kind of influenced the format of your narratives?
Yeah, sure. It was, since I was talking about a real threat of violence against the trans community I was sharing before, I decided to do a multimedia work with the long form article, but also with illustrations and comics. And there are 3 reasons why I decided to go with comics and illustrations and not with pictures. First, the lack of visuals. So we are talking about transfeminicide, we're talking about violence. If we don't want to do yellow journalism, we need to, being sensationalist, we have to be very careful with the images that we're going to portray. And one idea that came to my mind that it could be more sensitive and try to represent what this community, how this community is feeling in Brazil, it was through illustrations and comics. Secondly, because I feel that comics, it's a way to democratize information, and it's not everyone that is up to reading a long form format, although there are graphics and the language is very accessible, but in general, it's a long form. So then the comics come to kind of engage more with this social media community and to bring those narratives and debates out there as well. So I think it's very important, and I truly believe that social media can be a tool for advocacy. So I feel that the comics were working well on this sphere as well. And thirdly, it was a surprise for me after the project that actually the trans people that I interviewed, I think 6, 7 people that I interviewed, came back to me saying, actually, we felt so grateful that you did this comics, because my story, just to see my story come to life, it really mattered to me. And it seemed that, like, I don't know how, but it helped them, their personal journey to see that they're worth it of having their voices heard. They're worth it of being represented. And also because of the communication, right? I forgot to mention that, but the illustrator was constantly talking to them to check if these comics were appreciated by them, if they represented them fairly in terms of voice, in terms also of visuals. So I feel we could try in these difficult themes like violence and transphobia to go for different formats, like comics, for example, and just making sure that it's humanizing and that people are also okay with having their images and stories shared on those spaces.
Yeah, I thought that was a really creative approach to that challenge. While we're on the topic of formats of stories, Don, I want to hear a bit more about your investigation and how you were able to quantify disinformation on social media. I feel like that's such a broad thing to investigate, and why you kind of chose this approach to this bill in your country.
Yeah, thank you. First, it's for practical reasons. I've always specialized in disinformation research and data journalism, so it was quite natural for me to take that approach. So, and I thought that it would be interesting to apply my skills for something that I'm already familiar with, being queer myself. But I think it's very natural for me to take a disinformation approach also, because I think the LGBT rights movement itself is just one huge fight against disinformation. If you think about it, also, we have been for so long just pushing back against a lot of false claims and lies being told about us as people, as a community. And I was kind of frustrated about the number of falsehoods on the bill, the SOGI bill, on social media at the time, and the lack of data-driven reporting about the topic. And our usual response to falsehoods, not just for LGBT topics, but as advocates and journalists, is to fact check, right? So we're responding to lies online one at a time. But of course, fact checking is very important still. But if it's all we do, it turns into like a whack-a-mole game, because you correct one false content and another is posted the next day, and it's harder to catch up because it's easier to make up lies, and lies are sometimes also more appealing. So I wanted to zoom out my study, and that's where I did network and narrative analysis. So after I worked very closely with data scientists who also helped me with my in being able to do so, to study networks online, and to do natural language processing, because my goal was not just to identify the lies, the narratives that corrupt the understanding of the bill, or our understanding of the SOGI bill, but also to identify the networks that create and cascade the information, the disinformation. Because I really wanted to show that we were not just up against random misinformed Christians speaking their minds online. It was a whole campaign that sat on the foundation of lies, false claims, and logical fallacies. And these are organized and coordinated networks led by actors notorious for disinformation, empowered by platforms that do not care about the lies they amplify. And I think this is where relying on data, like Esther said, is important in covering LGBT story. I think, data allow you to pull up to the big picture. Of course, the human stories, the human element, is very important, and you need to humanize your data. Like how I tried to do it with my story, because that makes it relatable to the audience. But if we're also only like focus on the individual stories, people don't see the big picture, that the problem we're presenting is not isolated, it's not an isolated case, that many more people have the same experience, and that the problem is systemic. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for providing a little more insight on that. So as we've talked about, there's the safety of the sources, but also in a lot of these countries, there's the consideration of the safety of the journalist reporting on these issues. So Mahmoud, you've been reporting on LGBTQ issues in Syria since 2005, but eventually left the country. Can you tell us a bit about that experience and your work with Moala?
Yeah, I mean, the situation in Syria, as I said, I mean, there is the cultural thing about like homophobia, and plus the imprisonment of gay men. Basically, it was like, mostly like gay men. It's an archaic French law that remained in Syria from the French mandate after World War, and the thing is, as back then, it was I managed to let's say stay safe in Syria between 2005 and 2011, and then like when I left and started Moaleh from abroad, many of the people who contributed to the magazine and were still in Syria. So for me, it was also a matter of their safety, not to use their names, especially during the war, because like it was a war situation, because everything was more homophobic. Extremists were like just like, pouring into the country from everywhere. There was also like, homosexuality was used from like early on as a propaganda tool. As if it's like, it was used the same way that like, let's say Putin and Russia use it as a Western conspiracy to spread homosexuality in the country and so on. And for that, like, even that, like, the risk that started before it was heightened and like more risky. And we had also like, I had also some communication with other organizations that train journalists and also that protect journalists, because for me it was at the time I was already in safety somehow, more or less. I was based in Turkey, and for the people inside it was more about like, how can they leave the country if there is something happening, because journalists everywhere are, unfortunately, in the region, are like, need sometimes to flee for political reason. And it was even added with the homosexuality thing, just by writing for Mawaleh, you're outing yourself, and by associating yourself with me, you are being like politically anti-regime, and also like somehow like also anti Islamist somehow. So it was this safety was very important, how to protect them. We had a lot of trainings on like also online security, because most of the things reach me online, and how to cover, how they could cover their traces. And what I'm really proud of is that everybody eventually, like when they needed to leave Syria, it wasn't because of Mawaleh, it was because of something else. And yes, but of course, this thing is different from country to country. Like in Turkey, for example, when I was based in Turkey, I was based in South Turkey. The work on Mawaleh put me at risk, because I was going to northern Syria with foreign journalists and international journalists, and like foreign media as well. And it was easy to know that I have an online queer magazine, and I'm a gay person. So I had another displacement I had to move to Istanbul to stay away from the border because I was threatened to be kidnapped and killed in Syria. And for that, like, there was little protection. So fleeing the place was also was the best thing to do. And with that, it is somehow because of this, I also I also insisted on the other contributors who were in Syria that maybe we need to lay low a little bit because it's also it got some attention, and we needed to stop for a couple of months and then relaunch again. But it is something that happens in these situations. I mean, it's a war situation plus the added homophobia to the whole thing. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really interesting, though, the steps you took. Ankur, since you also founded a kind of similar initiative focused on LGBTQ reporting, I'm curious to talk a little bit more with you about why you started this and how you're using it to combat the historically dehumanizing language that we see of queer people in media, to try to help shift some of the public narrative.
Yeah. And thanks so much, Mahmoud, for sharing your experience with us. So for Queerbeat, I mean, really the goal of Queerbeat is to transform the public conversation about the LGBTQIA+ community in India. And why I want to transform this public conversation, as I mentioned before, even though it seems like we have laws in our favor, the community, the larger society actually is quite homophobic, transphobic, and queerphobic. Why I thought of starting Queerbeat was essentially because I am a queer person, and I have been, I'm also a journalist, so I have been in this industry. I've seen how historically queer people have been represented in the media. And you can there are just 4 or 5 kinds of narratives about queer people that exist in the media. It's, we are either comical in the representation, or the stories are gory, or the stories are of pity, tragic representations, or it's some sort of a spectacle. We are not represented as complex human beings as anybody else, and those were the kind of stories that I was looking for in the media that I was consuming when I was growing up, and those stories were not there. The queer community has been invisible in the media narratives, especially in small town India. So just to give you a brief context, when I'm growing up as a gay person, I need these stories in whatever kind of media I'm consuming. I'm not seeing it. And if people around me are seeing wrong representation, they don't want to be associated with the queer community. So it harms both ways. It harms people who are not queer and people who are queer. So really, the why I started Queerbeat is to make queer people visible in the stories, not just the stories about queer people, but in all the beats. We exist in health, we exist in environment, we exist in public transport, whichever beat you talk about. We are in stories of aging. So really to correct the narrative, and the goal is to bring an ecosystem change in the media, which is why we are intentionally very collaborative in nature. We publish stories in English, but we collaborate with language media outlets. There's so many languages in India. So the stories get translated, and then we ride on the readership or the audience reach of other media outlets that they have been serving in small towns of India, so that the conversations can happen in a language that people understand. So that's the larger goal of Queerbeat is, and story by story, we are trying to change the language. We are also trying to hold workshops with the media outlets to tell them that this is how you change the language about queer people, how you tell affirmative stories, what kind of information is not needed, what you have been doing wrong. I'll just give you very quickly an example that just a couple of months ago, there was a story in a very mainstream media outlet in southern India, which said homosexuality behind a businessman's murder. Well, while the murder happened because of financial reasons, and the person happened to be gay, but the media used the identity of the queer person to put on the headline, to bring the reader in. So our identities have historically been used as clickbaits, which is the narrative we want to change. It had no association, but this is what media, it tells you how media looks at us. And that happens because the queer representation in media houses is low, or the spaces are not safe, or we are not in leadership position. And so we're just trying to address all these challenges at different levels.
Yeah, and I love what you mentioned about telling positive LGBTQ stories, not only the tragic ones, as important as it is to address the issues that communities are facing, and also including queer voices in a variety of topics. We know that there are LGBTQ people who are experts on environment and health and all sorts of things. And while their gender and sexuality inform that, the story doesn't only always have to be about gender and sexuality. So as we're nearing the end of our time here, I just want to open it up to any of our panelists. Do you have further thoughts on how this kind of increased diversity of representation in media can help queer communities with the public perceptions and cultures that they're living in?
I mean,
I can
also
share.
but go ahead. Yes.
I know, go ahead, Dar. Yeah.
No, I always have a lot to talk. You go ahead first.
Okay, no, just making sure that, like Ankur said before, queer community is plural. They're complex human beings, and they're all in all spheres working, advocating, and living. They're making art, they're doing sports, they're in politics, they're scientists. So I think it's significant to tell and to denounce what is happening to them, like I did about transfemicide, to seek for justice, to seek for public policies, but we cannot just represent them as victims, right? As journalists, we shouldn't just put this queer community in the gender box and keep them there alone. So I think we need to humanize queer people and look at the media agenda and sources more broadly, and invite them to those conversations to talk about other stuff other than gender struggles. And of course, gender is intersectional, right? So it's mainstreaming everything. It's we can talk about gender, but just talking in a broader conversation and consider them, the queer community, in other cases. For example, I have the podcast called Feminisms del Sur, and I invited to one of the episodes a scientist who's called Brigitte Baptiste. She's a trans woman, but she's a biologist, she's a PhD, she's a scientist, and I called her to talk about science, to talk about how we can decolonize science, and listen to the voices from the South. So I think there is something about representation that is really powerful, and we should be telling stories of queer people anywhere in society to show their capacity. So when trans people aren't visible in different journalism editorials, their experiences aren't visible either. So just sharing this.
Yeah, Mahmoud.
Correct.
No, go
Okay.
ahead, Don.
Yeah, I agree with Esther also. I think we just need to we need people to see that we are more than our struggles. Like Esther said, there's like an LGBT in every sector. A lot of us are living very interesting lives. Many of us have broken boundaries and have become experts and great in whatever we're doing. I think it's important for people to see that, and that we deserve to have a voice in issues that matter, that we are capable of being great, even more if we're allowed to be, if we're given the same opportunities, and that the community, that people need to see that we are living very colorful lives. I think it's a disservice to the community to present their lives as otherwise. Um, a lot of people, I think, the broader goal of the LGBT movement also is to be able to resonate with people outside their communities, outside the LGBT circle. And I think one problem is that a lot of people who are not LGBT find it hard to relate to our struggles because they live in very different realities. So they may not even read their stories if they're all about, the struggles that and their sad realities, right? So I think even slowly, if they're seeing us in broader topics, this helps humanize us and hopefully help them, have a better have more empathy towards us as fellow human beings, even if they're not ready to read about our struggles now. They at least start to see that we're also very diverse and we're very, like I said, very complex human beings. Yeah.
Mahmoud, did you want to share something as well?
Yeah, I just wanted to just also what to build on what Ankur and Esther said about positive images and getting out of this victimhood thing. The we had this Mr. Gay Syria idea, and then with time it had to be done outside of Syria because, we were all refugees, and it turned to be a refugee document more than like Syrian document, but it played like this double role somehow. It's like it just showed refugees, LGBT refugees in particular, LGBT refugees. It showed LGBT refugees as people and who have lives, who take control of their lives, and they want to do something with their lives, and also it also like connected some sort of because with other Syrians it was this thing was unseen, our struggle also as LGBT people in the whole Syrian story with the migration and displacement and how the war affected us. And then you had the Syrians seeing how also we struggled, it was something also with the Syrian. The common thing was and most refugees as well, is that we want to be seen as humans, not only refugees, and we want to see it to be seen as thing. And then this particular thing of identity was it opened discussions within Syria, Syrian communities outside, within even with the hate speech. It's just we are more visible somehow. People agreed to come into this to highlight something. And then, like I said, Syrians in Berlin, Syrians in Europe, they talk about suddenly about LGBT rights in Syria, and when to discuss it, feminists in Syria started just paying attention to the queer cause, because this was always a blind spot that we have in that region. Culturally, we are not visible, and yes, positive stories, strong stories about strong characters. It was important. I really saw good results of this. I saw the positive impact of these things.
Yeah, thank you so much, everyone. I would love to continue this conversation, but I do want to be mindful that we're nearing the end of our time here. And I think I can speak for a lot of audience members when I say that I'm really excited to continue following all of your work and see the impact that it'll continue to have. I do want to share that we have 2 more upcoming events that we don't have dates finalized on yet, but we're super excited about. One focused on specifically trans reporting and trans journalists in the field, with some of the leading trans and non-binary journalists in association with the Trans Journalist Association. So that webinar will be coming up, as well as another one focused specifically on queer elder communities. As Ankur mentioned, the underrepresentation of queer elders and the impact that can have on our community, of having people to look up to. So I'd encourage you to check out the events page on our website and sign up for our email to stay tuned for more on those upcoming events. We appreciate all of you in the audience joining us today. And for those of you who are able, we would love if you consider becoming a Pulitzer Center champion to continue supporting the excellent work that these grantees are doing. Finally, a brief survey will follow the end of this webinar. We would really appreciate you taking just a couple minutes to share any thoughts on how we can improve our events. Again, thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you to all of our panelists. This was an excellent conversation. And yeah, we hope to see you again at future Pulitzer Center events. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.